Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm Go Local News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in this Tuesday afternoon on the Thanksgiving holiday week. And as we usually do, but we've missed her a couple of weeks with the busyness of the election cycle, check in with Jennifer Lawless, political professor of political science at the University of Virginia, Skyping in from an undisclosed location today. Jennifer, thank you for joining us.
Of course.
Well, you've been certainly busy since the elections, and now we're starting to see the dust settle a little bit, but some things aren't completely settled. Let's talk about Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Is she really facing any challenge?
She's definitely facing a challenge. It's hard to imagine that she won't eke out a victory by a pretty substantial margin. The challenge, of course, is that if it looks like the Democratic Party is splintered, or if it looks like a substantial number of Democrats are not willing to support her, that could threaten her leadership, and it could also send a signal to the Republicans that they have room to sort of make a power play. So it looks better when the party is cohesive, and it looks better when everybody's enthusiastic about the leadership, especially when it's leadership that's taking over the majority.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Here in Providence yesterday, Jennifer, at Brown University, some students associated with Sunrise RI were outside the speech where Tom Perez was addressing a crowd here in Providence, basically calling on him and his role overseeing the DNC. Now, this pertains to what they had said they would not take fossil fuel contributions, and then flipped on that promise. Probably a couple dozen young folks out there trying to, again, have a public face, do some press. Do we see some even increasingly splintering? I mean, we see it with the pressure on Pelosi, but, maybe of the Bernie crap vein, if you will, kind of sensing that there might be some opportunity to make some plays here.
I think we are seeing that. The irony, of course, is that they're going to cut off their noses to spite their faces. And what a lot of these groups need to realize is that for the first time in many years, the Democrats have an opportunity to put forward an agenda that, should the Democrats control the White House in 2020, could really be implemented. So now is the time to demonstrate the way they differ from the Republican Party and to highlight these huge differences in policy preferences between the GOP and the Democrats. It's probably not the best time to highlight relatively small differences within the Democratic Party, because we saw the Tea Party do that in 2010, and it just led to complete chaos.
So do you think they should be learning, again, those lessons from the Tea Party about this inter-party fighting?
I think nobody ever thinks of themselves as the difficult faction, right? And so it's important, I think, for the Democratic leadership to make it clear that they're willing to move in a progressive direction. They're willing to talk to all of these new members. They're willing to highlight what they want their vision to look like. But there also has to be some level of practical politics moving forward, or else they'll find themselves completely ill-equipped to deal with the 2020 electoral environment.
So I have to take this opportunity to tack to an issue on the other side of the aisle. Let's talk about the Senate as we know it before we go to the Mississippi runoff. But let's talk a little bit about criminal justice reform. Now, this was touted by some as being a bipartisan approach to the issue. Lindsey Graham press over the weekend said that there's over 80 combined votes. Mitch McConnell, little deer in the headlight. So if this is truly a bipartisan effort, and this is something that sounds like could be achieved, why the holdup?
Well, it's a bipartisan effort in part because it's tiny and will make almost no meaningful difference at all. So Democrats have been pushing for prison reform and for criminal justice reform for a very long time. And certain libertarian groups, as well as the Koch brothers, for example, have also been pushing for this. The bill on the table would do almost nothing. It doesn't apply to state prisons, obviously. It would apply only to about 3% of the federal prison population. And what that means is a few thousand people's sentences would be reduced or cut because of drug offenses. So it's not to say that it's nothing, but in the broad scheme of things, the policy is quite narrow, and the money that it would save is quite narrow as well. So why Mitch McConnell doesn't want to move this forward is actually beyond me. The only thing that I can think of is that he's anticipating that when the House is controlled by Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats will push for more meaningful prison reform, and he'll then be able to frame the debate as the Democrats going far too ahead of themselves, and, that would be a way to get nothing. But, Donald Trump has said, my pen is ready, I'm going to sign this. It doesn't make much sense to me as to why Mitch McConnell wants to defy quite a few of the more senior members of the Senate.
I mean, you can say what you will about Mitch McConnell. He's been a skillful leader for the Republicans in the Senate. I mean, you might have a little insight into the way his brain works being a political scientist, because that certainly sounds like it could be a rationale. But it was interesting, again, to see Lindsey Graham just making the case for it on Sunday. And, of course, Mitch McConnell having the brakes on it for now, so to speak. But let's take a look at what we're looking at around the country as well. Runoff in Mississippi.
This is one of these races that I think highlights that it doesn't matter what you say on the campaign trail anymore. Cindy Hyde-Smith, who is the Republican incumbent currently serving, who's seeking her first full term, was caught on tape twice saying that suppressing the vote is not the worst thing in the world in certain districts, and it would actually help her. And there doesn't really seem to be any backlash in Mississippi. And so it's hard to imagine a scenario whereby she doesn't cross the 50% threshold. And I think, it's really emblematic of a much broader problem in U.S. politics, which is that it's okay to do anything you possibly can to win.
Speaking of doing anything in politics, a very interesting piece of irony, a little news story this week about Ivanka Trump's emails and what she might have been using on her personal versus governmental devices. Just deja vu all over again, but on the other side of things.
And we're also not walking around chanting "lock her up." So, I think there is a bit of a difference here, and it speaks to the broader hypocrisy. If this was such an important issue to Donald Trump, and if he genuinely believed that Hillary Clinton had threatened national security and deserved to be in prison, not only for using a personal server, but also for not being fully aware of what she was doing, then it's hard to imagine how he can defend this behavior. Granted, Ivanka Trump is not Secretary of State, but she was transmitting information that probably should not have been transmitted on a personal email device, and there were security clearances that were breached. So, I think this also speaks to this broader idea of, well, it's okay if we don't play by the rules, but we're just going to hold everybody else accountable when they violate them. And it really, I think, makes it a lot easier for the Democrats to argue that the Trump administration doesn't think that it has to follow the rules and the laws, that it's been pretty harsh in terms of directing toward everybody else.
Staying on the theme of the Trump administration, the news that just came out today from D.C., President Donald Trump saying that he would stand by Saudi Arabia. Now, again, this is the fallout of the murder, the Khashoggi murder, and whether the Crown Prince had a role in it or not. It was interesting. We saw the president really take that pro-Saudi stance right away, sort of take that step back once some evidence was produced and more evidence continued to come out. And now we see him continue to be tethered to the Saudi government. Does this surprise you? But also, what does this mean for international relations?
It doesn't surprise me because we've seen this back and forth. The president also today acknowledged that members of Congress, many of whom are in his own party, think that he's not handling this well, and they would take a different position and think that there should be, more penalties and sanctions imposed on the Saudi government. As far as international relations are concerned, it's complicated because this obviously helps the United States with Saudi Arabia, but it calls into question a lot of other alliances that we have when we're clearly willing to say, you know what, we're going to let this one go. I think it also speaks to this broader issue of the president not necessarily placing freedom of the press at the top of his list. There's been quite a bit of speculation as to how he would have handled this if Khashoggi had not been a journalist. And at a time where he's treated journalists pretty pathetically, when he's called them the enemy of the people, when he's suggested that he can now write new rules for the White House press corps, his reaction helps push this narrative that he's basically been developing on his own, which is that he just has no respect for journalism or for an independent press. And I think in a lot of ways that threatens democracy more than the relationship with the Saudi government more broadly.
Speaking of the press, I do have a last little bit, a little interesting tidbit here from Rhode Island, Jennifer, that I want to bring to your attention and talk about. Yesterday at a RIPTA meeting, there was a journalist there, Steve Alquist, who was told he couldn't tape an open meeting. Now, he brought this attention to the ACLU, who raised the issue today. RIPTA's response was that they had, again, made a mistake, but they were going to ask any reporters moving forward if they wouldn't mind not taping the public comment period because people might feel uncomfortable. Is that in any way, shape, or form a viable suggestion?
It's a viable suggestion. It's not a viable policy to implement if anybody actually cares what happens at these meetings. Now, I understand that it's different to be a citizen who's engaging in direct democracy than it is an elected official or the head of an organization or a policymaker. But if you're going to voice your opinion or attend these meetings, you know full well that this is the way the process works and that getting your argument on the books is part of the process. And so, I'm very, very leery of any ways that any government or any, institution is trying to push back on open access to meetings, open access to information, and freedom of the dissemination of that information. And I'm probably more attentive to that now, as are a lot of political scientists, politicians, pundits, because we're seeing this pushback from the White House.
Again, it was an interesting piece of information that came to light yesterday that we're continuing to follow here. So Jennifer Lawless, professor of political science at the University of Virginia, we thank you for Skyping in as you do most weeks and wish you a very happy Thanksgiving holiday.
Happy Thanksgiving to you too.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back with our next guest here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center.